like to think about things in terms of water scarcity. For me, a well running dry is one of the most pronounced manifestations of water scarcity. Somebody's losing access to water that's impacting either their ability to irrigate land, so impacting their ability to produce agricultural products, but also impacting the ability of people to exercise their right to withdraw groundwater. And so there's so many different components here. There's access to drinking water, water for agricultural production, but then also this idea that dry wells are impacting somebody's right.
When I first came to the reserve, where my parents grew up, there still were houses with no drinking water.
Well, the system is geared to not work, and this gets back to the whole colonial thing.
When I started this job, they didn't even understand who I was or what I was doing.
It's geared for failure. It was designed to fail.
And I'm still struggling to repair those water plants right now.
To break the backs of a people. And the backs have not been broken is the story.
Many of these forests are essentially overstocked, right? They have a buildup of too many trees, and during droughts, those trees are competing for a very finite amount of soil water, and so you have tree mortality associated with drought conditions. All of this ends up producing forests where there's a heck of a lot of fuel and there hasn't been enough fire. And so when wildfires happen, that's when we see these massive conflagrations in forests that were not adapted to that incredibly high intensity fire.
And we're live on Zoom and Facebook Live.
All right, thanks everybody. Pleasure to see everyone. And
Hi,
good
James.
morning or good afternoon from wherever you may be joining us. Can everyone hear me okay before I launch into our intro? Good. Okay. Well, welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jay Famiglietti. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Institute for Water Security up here in Saskatoon at the University of Saskatchewan. It's really a pleasure for me to be able to moderate and host this Let's Talk About Water Community Forum, where we want to encourage and create discussion on important water issues and how that affects all of us around the world. Let's Talk About Water is a film and water symposium founded by our dear friend and film historian, Linda Lilienfeld, with the goal of making science communications on water issues and climate change more accessible and more enjoyable. This forum is a way for us to have these types of conversations. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being hosted by the University of Saskatchewan, which is on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We know that many of you are joining us from around the world, and I hope that you'll take a moment to acknowledge and pay respect to one another as well. So today I'm really excited for this because we're going to be talking about something that's near and dear to my heart, a subject I spent a lot of time in a good part of my academic career studying, and that's groundwater. We're calling the title of the forum today, Natural Systems, Human Nature and Common Ground, the story of groundwater, and it's the theme for our programming on the Let's Talk About Water virtual theater site. So if you haven't had a chance to check out Sweet Oranges, which I have not, and Water and Power, a California Heist, which I'm in, please check out Let's Talk About Water.ca after this event, where you can screen the films for free, and they take deeper dives into this really important topic. So just a few rules for the audience. There'll be 15 minutes for questions after the formal part of our discussion. Please type your questions into the chat along with your name and where you're joining us from. You can ask any of the guests or myself, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. Now, let's get to our guests. Today, I'm joined by 3 individuals, each with a unique perspective on the topic: Debra Perrone, Neno Kukurik, and Michael Nemeth. I'll just briefly introduce each of our panelists and then ask them to say just a few minutes about their research. Dr. Debra Perrone is an assistant professor with the University of California, Santa Barbara Environmental Studies Program, and a recent guest on our Let's Talk About Water podcast, and a distinguished lecturer here at USask. That conversation we had with Deb and the lecture she gave here at USask really became an inspiration for this talk today. We had a great conversation on the podcast. Debra, I'm really excited to have you to be able to chat with you again. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and your interest in groundwater?
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, Jay. I'm interested in water scarcity challenges, and specifically my research now focuses on groundwater because of how fundamental it is to supplying water for irrigation and water for domestic supplies. And I'm currently looking at places where groundwater levels are declining so significantly that people's wells are going dry. So they're losing access to groundwater in their homes. And to me, this is really one of the starkest examples of groundwater and water scarcity, when people don't have access in their homes to potable water.
Thanks very much, Deb. We'll look forward to chatting with you a little bit more. I'm also joined by Dr. Neno Kukurik, old friend and colleague. Neno is the director of the International Groundwater Resources Assessment Center, or IGRAC. He's a hydrogeologist with about 30 years experience, gained worldwide working as a field hydrogeologist, a consultant, scientific researcher, and a project manager. Neno, please tell us a bit about yourself and your work with groundwater and the work of IGRAC.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you for inviting me, almost 40 years, so work all over the world, and where you want me to start, and my connection with groundwater. Well, my connection with groundwater actually started in my hometown, which receives almost 5,000 millimeters of rain during the year, which is a lot, 5 meters, but during the summer, everything is dry. So that's, I was asking myself where this water is going to. Well, 40 years later, I'm still not sure, but I learned some other things about groundwater, especially with the IGRAC Center. I'm leading already more than 10 years. And what we are trying to do all over the world is to make noise, to make as much possible noise about invisible groundwater. And we are UN affiliated center, so we work a lot on transboundary groundwaters, because about 60% of large aquifers are transboundary, because groundwater is stupid, it doesn't stop at the border. Can you imagine that? So this is just a little bit about my work. Thanks.
Thanks, Neno. Good to see you. Hope we can get to see you in person, and all of you. Hope we can get to see each other in person sometime soon. We're also joined by Michael Nemeth. Michael, you and I haven't met before. Pleasure to meet you virtually. Michael is a senior advisor in agricultural and environmental sustainability at Nutrien. Nutrien, for those of you who are not from the region, is based here in Saskatchewan, but is a huge provider of basically the inputs, potassium and potash and nitrates for fertilizer. So Michael currently supports implementation of Nutrien's carbon.
Hello?
Jay, your audio disconnected for a moment. You're muted.
What did you hear and not hear?
You started my introduction, but that's okay.
So maybe I'll just read it again. Michael, is that okay? I mean, I said
Sure.
that you're Nutrien. I explained what Nutrien was, which is a company that provides a huge provider of inputs to fertilizer, potash, phosphates, nitrates. And I mentioned that you are in charge of sustainability, working on the carbon program, leading the global water stewardship efforts. Sound good?
Yes, that works. That sums it up. So yeah, thanks, Jay. Yeah, so I work for Nutrien. As Jay said, we are the world's largest supplier of agricultural inputs, services, and solutions. And so we play a critical role in helping growers increase food production in a sustainable manner. So we would do everything from production of fertilizers, so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We have a strong presence in Saskatchewan, where Jay is based, where we have 6 potash mines. But our water footprint can be seen in all areas of our value chain. So from raw material development, our suppliers, our direct operations, and even our product use. So we have retail facilities in North America, South America, and Australia, where we actually work on the ground with growers, providing support both through digital tools and solutions, as well as inputs. But as the world's largest supplier of agricultural inputs and services, Nutrien is also a global leader in nutrient stewardship and agricultural sustainability. And we certainly value and support growers and the agricultural industry in stewardship of agriculture's greatest inputs, which are nutrients and water. So my role in particular is part of our sustainability and stakeholder relations team. I'm based in Calgary, Alberta, at one of our 4 corporate head offices. And it's really to support agricultural and environmental sustainability across the company and through partnerships. And I do that around aspects of air, land, and water. And so from a groundwater perspective, we use groundwater, and we're also mindful that farming can also have an impact in terms of groundwater contamination. And so we work diligently to make sure that both our operations and the downstream use of our products are not causing those impacts as much as possible. So.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael, and nice to meet you. And of course, you know, one of the big things that I've become interested in over the last few years, and in part largely driven by the research that I do, is the connection between food security and water security, in particular the work that I have done, like a global groundwater depletion, and recognizing that a lot of that depletion is happening in the world's great food producing region. So, you know, we have to work to sustain our groundwater so that we can keep producing food for a growing population. Okay, so let's get started. Debra, we'll start with you. Can you tell us why groundwater is important?
Groundwater is important because it's fundamental to livelihoods. So it supplies irrigation to more than 40% of global agriculture. And in the United States specifically, it provides more than 50% of the water for irrigated agriculture. A lot of people don't realize this, but around the 1960s, we sort of topped out for groundwater use in the United States. And we've been using pretty consistent amount of groundwater since then. And most of that groundwater goes to irrigated agriculture, with a really important but smaller component going towards public supply. And so groundwater is fundamental to producing food, but also fundamental for providing safe, clean drinking water.
Okay, thanks very much, Deb. I mean, one thing about groundwater, and we've talked about this before, you know, it's a little bit out of sight and out of mind for a lot of people. And Nino, I want to turn to you and just ask you about your work with IGRAC in trying to help expose, right, and collect data, expose people to, you know, raise awareness of the importance of groundwater.
Yeah, it's a challenging task, you know. But if it was easy, probably we would talk about something else. Well, informed management means to have a good monitoring and assessment that it's much more easier to monitor surface water than groundwater. The surface water, if you see that level is dropping or changing, water is changing the color, you can mobilize media and public. But groundwater, you don't see that those things are happening, and when you realize, then it's often late. So we are advocating for systematic monitoring and all over the world, and because you can't really just put a piezometer and monitoring well in the ground, and then you need historical data also to predict what is going to be in the future. So that's very important. And because people don't see what's going on in the groundwater, it's very difficult to convince decision maker to invest in monitoring and assessment. So it's some kind of closed circle, and that's the reason that we need extra effort to raise a case about groundwater.
Thanks very much, Neno. So, Michael, I'd like to turn to you and just ask you a question specifically about nutrient and your groundwater use in your operations. Do you rely on it? To what degree do you rely on it? Let's just focus here in Canada.
Yeah, so in Canada, our primary use of groundwater would be twofold in our retail facilities. So our retail facilities are across Western Canada, and they're often in areas where they rely on groundwater wells for potable water. We don't use a ton of water in our retail facilities, but there is some degree of water use for crop applications, but mainly potable water. In terms of our mining and the mining industry as a whole, the potash mining industry as a whole in Canada, we don't use a great deal of groundwater in relative to our surface water consumption. We source surface water from most of the mines that we operate. We have one mine that uses all groundwater. The rest either use a combination of surface water and groundwater, or just surface water. I think, and that's fairly similar for most of the mines in Alberta, or in Saskatchewan. One of the things that we do is deep well disposal. So when I think about groundwater, I often think about fresh versus non-fresh sources. And when we do deep well disposal, we're going very deep underground, looking at disposal in aquifers that are already saline, or formations that are suitable for that sort of thing. And then when we're sourcing, we're trying to source fresh but not super fresh water, because a certain amount of salinity is actually good for our processes when you're mining potash. So
thanks very much. It's for those of us in academics, we don't often interface with people in industry, so it's great to have you on the panel and hear about the different ways that you're using groundwater. In the whole disposal thing, it's becomes an issue, or it may become an issue in the future. And there's always the fear, right, of maybe contaminating clean groundwater, right, potable groundwater in the disposal process. There's the future discussions I think will be had in the future about the use of that porosity when we think about things like carbon storage and CO2 sequestration. Do you think about that at all in Nutrien?
We do. We look at the formations. My understanding, I'm not a geologist, my understanding is that the process does work, and it does have long-term applicability. But yeah, when you look at the volumes that we're putting down, and then also the distances that we go down, several kilometers below the surface, even below at which we're mining, we're fairly confident in, as an industry, and in what those are able to hold. So,
okay, Thanks, Michael. So in my work with the GRACE mission, we see trends where the dry areas of the world are getting drier and wet areas of the world are getting wetter. It's especially true for some of these hot spots around the world, the Middle East, Northern India, California. Deb, in your research, you've put together this monster data set of something like 12 million wells. What are you seeing in your research, and what do we need to be concerned about? What should we be thinking about?
So in my research, what we're doing is we're mapping where people are using groundwater. So we're putting together data sets that actually stitch information together that we've never had stitched together before. And like Nino indicated earlier, groundwater doesn't really recognize these jurisdictional boundaries. And so our goal is to put together a view of what the subsurface looks like in terms of how humans are impacting that subsurface. And so when I think about what I'm actually concerned about, I break it down into 3 different things. First, how is depletion impacting people's access to water? I'm extremely concerned about this, people not having access to potable drinking water in their house. Second, not capturing diverse stakeholders. I think it's fundamental that we have diverse stakeholders at the table when we're talking about groundwater sustainability. And I think it's really important to start thinking about how do we get diverse stakeholders to the table, given all of the constraints that are happening in the background. And then third, I'm really concerned about passing thresholds. Groundwater depletion is an extremely complex challenge that we have. And I think that it's not going to change in the future. It's going to be complex. We have complex science. We have complex human dimensions going on. Groundwater is fundamental to livelihoods. So it's impacting people's culture. It's impacting the economies, local to global. And so I'm really interested in figuring out what sort of solutions do we have to move forward. I'm an optimist. I don't think the solutions are going to be simple, but I do think that there's a range of solutions out there, and we just have to start understanding what those trade-offs look like.
Okay, thanks, Deb. So, Michael, I wanted to, since Deb mentioned stakeholders, I'm wondering if in some of these discussions that are happening, we're talking about this big potential irrigation expansion in Saskatchewan. We're talking about, Canada Water Agency. Nutrien is a big stakeholder. I'm wondering if you've been invited to participate in these discussions.
Yeah, we have actually, Jay. We've, as part of the Canada Water Agency or Canadian Water Agency, we have been at those discussions. We're very active in the water space globally at all of our jurisdictions, so both North America, South America, and Australia. And we always take the approach of we don't think we can do everything, and we don't want to be seen as doing everything on our own. But what we want to do is partner. And we realize that when we look at water, it's very different than our approach to carbon, and that you need to partner, and it needs to be at a local level. And groundwater is a bit different because you can't just necessarily as easily define those boundaries as you can with surface water when you look at a watershed. But certainly from our operational standpoint is we look within our watersheds, we look upstream and downstream of us, and then we understand the context of who's in our watershed. And that's what water stewardship is. And that's where our focus as a company has shifted away from that site water management into that more broad water stewardship, where we're looking outside of our fence line, understanding the context in which we're using water in the watershed that we're using it. And then in the watersheds that we're operating. So yeah, certainly when we look at the stakeholder engagement, we certainly try to be at the table, especially for the bigger things, but also on the ground and the more local things as well.
So yeah, good to hear that you're basically looking upstream and downstream within the watershed. So Nino, Deb also mentioned access, and I'm just wondering about your view on basically is right water a human right? What about the limits to access when it comes to the 3 of us, yourself, Deb, and myself? We realize groundwater tables are falling, and there's a need to dig deeper and deeper wells, and those wells are getting more and more expensive. I mean, what is your view on the access issue?
Well, I think that the state of groundwater is actually is a reflection of the state of society. I mean, how we deal with each other and how we deal with the environment. We deal with the groundwater the same way. I mean, access to water, as you mentioned, is a universal human right. But still, 1 of 6 people in the world doesn't have access to safe water. And for those who saw the film from California, it seems that some citizens of California do not have access to water, which is a shame, and in such a rich country. So that's the way it is, and that's the reason that we are talking here, to see how we can change a bit what's going on around, including Michael.
Well, we're glad we have him on the panel. Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, and it's kind of a segue into the movie that's being featured this month, Water and Power, California Heist. So just a 30-second critique. I liked that movie. I advised a little bit on that movie and some of the storylines. I appeared in it pretty briefly. I found it to be very interesting, especially if you're into the sort of legal framework that sort of explains the groundwater situation and how it came to be in California. So it's a little dry, no pun intended. It goes heavy into the legal side, but it, you know, it just raises this issue about you know, I think this is the way, you know, I think as scientists, we'd like to think that everybody wants to do the best for water, and that industry should behave the same way. And it's not, you know, it's not that way. We read all the time about, there's just another story, I can't remember, I think it was Nestle, you know, buying up some more water. I can't remember, I know it was recent, I just can't remember where it was, but, you know, buying up some more water from a spring to, you know, to bottle more water. It's nice to think, you know, we'd like to think that corporations want to behave in the, you know, in the best interest of water sustainability. And I think the movie tells us otherwise. So let's just get your reflections, and, you know, just start with you, Michael. I know you maybe haven't seen the movie yet, but you should. But just your, you know, reflection on sort of, you know, what's Nutrient's perspective on, again, it gets to access, but just throw it out there.
Well, I certainly think, well, I did see the movies. I watched both of them and really enjoyed the California water heist. I've had a background in water globally for the last 10 years. And when we think about access, I always think, and, you know, in my time in the water sector, nothing is ever fair in life, and everybody's going to have a different perspective. At the end of the day, I personally feel, and I know Nutrien feels, that you have to have water for communities, and you have to have water, because if you don't have your communities, then you're not going to have a business. So we need to make sure that sustainable actually focuses not just on social and environment, but also economic. So if you can't make those three work, then clearly that, you know, there's a balance issue in those watersheds. But I would say that what we need to be starting to do is looking at how much water is there, what's the availability, and maybe what should be grown there. So for example, when you're looking at the California story, as I'm sitting there watching it, and this is just from my personal perspective, if we can't grow oranges and almonds without depleting the water sources, maybe we grow something different there, right? And so you change what you're growing where and move the orange development somewhere else. But again, there's social challenges with that. There's legal challenges with that. There's a bunch of different things, and that's the problem with water, is once you start involving it's the water management is easy. It's the people and the issues behind it and the perspectives, because everybody's going to have a perspective on how that water should be used, where it should be used, why it should be used, and everybody's perspective is right. And so, you know, is it right for farmers to be pulling that much water? Well, is it right for people to be taking a 30-minute shower when there's places in the world where people don't even have showers? Like, it starts to, yeah, I could go on that, but I think at the end of the day, what the key is to make sure that it's balanced in the context of sustainability.
Right. So, Nino, I see you rather animated there. Do you want to contribute?
No, I mean, I'm very glad, you know, that Michael is here, and someone from Water Stewardship program is here, because you know, we need to talk to each other. And for me, it will be the easiest to say, look, whatever I hear from CEO of business, large multinationals, is greenwashing, and it's just money, money, and money. And if I look risk analysis done on groundwater in a large multinationals, it's you know, sometimes I really laugh. So, but then there are also a very good initiatives, and we need to search for common ground. And so to see what is actually incentive for large consumers of groundwater to take more care of groundwater. You know, we can't, from scientific point of view, I think we can't do anything about prices of groundwater to reduce it. But what we can do together is really to assess the risk of investment, because what is happening in California, but also what's happening all over the world, is a risk of assessment. If multinational, if large company doesn't invest together with the other stakeholders in a proper assessment and management of water resources in all catchment area or in aquifer as a whole, you know, the risk is that it will at a certain moment be forced to stop production. So that's one point. The other point is to come back to you know, motivation. I mean, not everyone thinks in the same way. I agree. You know, we live in parallel realities. But look, why do we have why we need so much agricultural production in California, and why, as a rich consumer from Europe, need to eat every morning berries from California in my cereal? You know, so it's here. We need a switch, another mindset of our mind setting, and that's a problem.
Yeah, so that, you know, the social behavioral change that's needed is really an important part of global water security, for sure, Nino, and thanks for bringing that up. Deb, I wanted to check in with you on a sort of related question. Just your thoughts. You know, you don't have to have any answers, but it's a typical professor, like, well, I've thought about it, but I don't really have the answer. When I give my talks and I talk about water security, I raise this issue that Michael raised, which is, you know, we have all these things that are competing for, you know, competing uses for water. So water for agriculture, you know, water for people, water for the environment, water to produce energy, right? Water for economic growth. I mean, how do we balance that?
So you actually hit on something that I spent years studying, trade-offs. How do we manage trade-offs? And I think as a scientist and engineer, I can give you all the different ways that we can optimize the allocation of water, but it's the people, it's the stakeholders that have to decide which uses they value most. And so this is fun, you know, as the engineer, I can put that all together. But For me, it's fundamentally bringing these stakeholders to the table so that they can decide and making sure that they have a voice at the table. And to me, it's all about a trade-off analysis. What do we value? Do we value the economy? Do we value the ecosystems? Do we value disadvantaged communities? Do we value ag? And maybe we value all of them, and there has to be a compromise here.
So I didn't realize I was hitting on your expertise, so that was perfect. So we have about maybe 6 minutes left before we turn the questions over to the audience. I kind of want to talk to you about communication. And I think, a few of us on the panel are involved in that. And let me just go back. I'll go back with you, start with you, Deb, and we'll cycle through the panel. I mean, how do we communicate these problems? Or in your work, what sort of strategies have you taken to communicate?
So I see two avenues here. One, storytelling, and then two, evidence. I think storytelling is fundamental. And I think this is one of the reasons why groundwater is so tricky. It's because it's hard to tell a story about groundwater. It's hard to do art, paintings, drawings about groundwater. And so I'm calling all the artists out there to come together and see if we could put something together to tell a better story about groundwater. And I think that the investigative journalism that's happening right now in California and in Arizona is fundamental to telling the story. And it's these stories that actually inspired my research, which is providing the evidence that I'm hoping is going to get things to change. And so in terms of evidence, my contribution is more on the quantitative side. So how do we use observational data? How do we use big data to really show that there's a concern here, or really show that there's an opportunity here? And so I think we can do that both on the scientific side, but also on the legal side. And that's both are components of the work that I'm currently doing.
Thanks, Deb. Michael, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with Deb's comments and back on her comments on trade-offs. That's what it is. It's all about trade-offs. And I think sometimes we, as society, that's including industry, academia, governments, we don't talk about openly those trade-offs. And I think that's the challenge. Is it's often seen as, well, it's either them or them. Well, it could be everyone, but here's the trade-offs. And so what do you want? What do you truly value? And sometimes I don't think it's the people's voice necessarily saying what they value. There's minorities or squeaky wheels that sometimes gets the grease, so to speak. And so you get certain perspectives and viewpoints, and those tend to drive political agendas, and those tend to make the decisions. But we're not necessarily communicating the true story, the full story, or, as Deb said, the evidence. And so I know that from our perspective, that's why we really try to partner on the water stewardship front with other companies to make sure that we're helping them tell the stories as part of our digital solutions, and working directly with farmers. We can actually help tell the stories, so we can measure, monitor, communicate, and be able to show, what is the value of the trade-off? And if we reduce, nitrogen here, what is the impact to yield? Because we have to balance, again, there's that trade-off between, well, let's not use fertilizer, but then we need to feed a growing world. So how do we do that in balance with both the environment, society, and economic needs?
Yes, that story. We call that story reality. That's the reality
life.
Show. Yeah. And Neno, how about you? I mean, you've done a fair amount of, IGRAC is really, a lot of IGRAC is about communication. Tell us about your efforts.
Yeah, well, of course, I agree with Michael, and of course, I agree with Debra, because she's coming from the same corner. But even I agree with Michael about this open and frank discussion. Because I've been discussing with large companies about their stewardship programs, and for a long time, and I keep doing that, and then exposing real facts, and talking about the values and rights of rich and poor and all corners of society. So this open and frank dialogue, I think it's very important. And next to it, you know, I think awareness raising it's extremely important, starting from the primary school, and then all kind of you know, new innovative means of communication. We see that, for instance, serious gaming it's quite successful in bringing up groundwater issue which you can't really visualize. So you know, social media, films like this one in California, what Debra said, this investigative journalism, everything you have in your arsenal, just use it.
Okay, thanks very much, Neno. I was busy typing a chat to everybody, which is it's open question time. And so we've got some questions in the Q&A. It'd be easier if everyone can put their questions in the Q&A so I can see them. And I will start working through them. And let's start with Fidelina Oliva. Greetings from Zamorano University, Honduras. Is there a possibility that the exploitation of groundwater instead of surface water leads to the loss of it? What alternatives do you suggest to have good management of surface and groundwater? And Deb, I'm going to throw this one to you.
Yes, I think that there's lots of scientific evidence that indicates that there are many places where our groundwater resources are connected to our surface water resources. I think that there are a lot of opportunities to figure out what we can do to make possible pathways here. The first one, I mean, we need to monitor our groundwater use. That's fundamental. And then we need to meter we need to meter groundwater wells, and we need to understand where people are pumping groundwater. And so I think fundamentally, regardless of, you know, whether or not you think that our legal system is good, common law versus a regulatory approach, I think baseline, we need to have data. We need to have evidence, information to inform our trade-offs and how we're going to move forward. And so for me, it's all about that first step of metering how much water we're pumping and monitoring our groundwater levels so we can understand how much of the humans impacting the system versus, you know, natural elements such as lack of precipitation and recharge.
Thanks, Deb. I have a question from Tyrone Miranda, who is basically saying, you know, a lot of groundwater depletion is because of human water use. What's going on around the world? And I'll throw this one to you, Neno. Maybe you can give us a global view with artificial recharge, managed recharge. You're familiar with what's happening in different parts of the world?
Yeah. Well, you know, this artificial recharge or putting more surface water underground in order to bridge over dry periods, it's a very powerful tool. It's actually one of the main climate change adaptation measures. However, people do that already for 2,000 years. You know, in Iran and in Yemen and etc. So it's not new. Techniques are new, and also there is a limitation. You know, if I talk to some good colleagues from California, from large industry, they will probably show me a lot of artificial recharge projects in California, enlarging supply, but equally we need to tackle demand, to reduce demand one way or the other.
Yeah, excellent point. We often look, so as you know, Neno, I spent a lot of time in California and even served on the state water boards for several years. And yeah, there's a huge focus on increasing the supply and perhaps not enough on trying to limit the demand. And even some of the things you were talking about before, Michael, about crop choices, those are huge but difficult. And California has taken a slightly different approach in terms of how it's managing groundwater, basically allowing those decisions to be local decisions about what gets grown. But as long as a sub-region within California complies with a sustainability plan that's been approved, then it's all good. So let me go back to the questions. This one, it has to be for you, Michael. Which fertilizers will be useful after 90 days of a wheat crop? I mean, once the wheat crop is 90 to 110 days of age, which fertilizers will be good for it?
Well, I saw that question, and I can't give you any specifics, but what I can tell you is that all crops, when you grow something, you're pulling nutrients out of the ground, which is why fertilizers have enabled us to feed a growing population, because we can replace those nutrients. What crops need at certain times, you just have to consult a local agronomist in your area. It could be nitrogen, could be micronutrients, could be macronutrients, but it depends on soil type, climate, crop, type of crop. There's a lot of variables in that question, but always best to talk to a local agronomist, which is what Nutrien offers, is those local expertise on soil health and what plants need in order to have a good crop. So,
thanks, Michael. So if I want to point us to this question by Robert Lutkeimer, and so we maybe can all weigh in on this, and it gets to the stakeholder engagement and back to the the balancing the competing needs. Thanks for the interesting statements. You're welcome, Robert. I'm sure you were speaking mostly to me. I'm Robert from ISOE Frankfurt. Balancing competing uses of groundwater is the critical question, and stakeholder involvement is a good way to go. What tools do you prefer for stakeholder engagement in various contexts? Maybe some good practice examples. How do you account for stakeholders who create an impact on local groundwater bodies remotely? So 2 questions, but maybe all 3 of you would like to weigh in on that. And Deb, we'll start with you.
So I don't have any, solutions to stakeholder engagement. I think this is actually a full area of research that folks are doing, especially in California. It's quite complex. And so I think that what people are trying to do is trying to get the information out to the different stakeholders using lots of different sort of outreach opportunities. I think one of the biggest problems that California is having right now, though, is that a lot of the sustainable groundwater management meetings are happening during working hours, during hours where maybe we can't get all the stakeholders to the table. And so I actually think that there's some low-hanging fruit here for us to be able to think about how do we bring stakeholders together and how do we make it reasonable for them to actually participate in these meetings.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about the timing of those meetings, but that's pretty critical. Neno, how about you? Any examples from your work with IGRAC?
Well, I like this question because it opens something else. It is, you have stakeholders, remote stakeholders. You have shortage of groundwater in California, but I'm also a stakeholder because I'm using that groundwater. We have virtual water, which goes with the products all over the world. So there is NGO from California, I think it's called Local Future, something like that. And these guys calculated that almost half of world trade is actually because of earning money and not that we need it. So basically, if I, as a stakeholder, want to support groundwater management in California, I should use a lot of products.
Okay, I've got a question here. So I've got questions on both sides, the Q&A and chat. Here's a question from Aaron Stevens. To inform, so this is for you, Michael, to inform stakeholders about groundwater use, what initiatives does Nutrien have in place? 40% of the world's agriculture, irrigated agriculture, depends on groundwater. What are our alternative options, both short and long term?
Well, I guess the first part is I think I heard about communicating our groundwater use. We disclose all of our as part of our ESG reporting. So for example, CDP water is one of those forms that we report on every year, and we publicly disclose all of our water use. So our consumption, our withdrawals, and our returns. That data is publicly available. And then in terms of what we do is we try to make sure that we are in areas where we operate in areas of higher water stress, that we're actually communicating and talking with the basin and having an understanding with the local community about, operations. And an example of that is at our Borger, Texas facility. We have a nitrogen facility there. It's in the panhandle of Texas. Having lived in Texas, I know how dry it is down there. And so when we actually looked at expanding our operations down there, we worked with the regional or the local municipality, the city of Borger, to be able to come up with an option to increase their groundwater capacity, so their wells, so that they could actually expand their capacity, we could expand our capacity, and we enabled that partnership to be able to sustainably source groundwater. So yeah, we work in our jurisdictions with our needs, and we report our needs as well. And I think there was a question around irrigation in there, Jay.
Second part, yeah, and I need to correct. I get some feedback on that. That question was actually from Palash Sanyal. Second part of the question depends on 40% of the world's agriculture depends on groundwater. What are alternative options, both short term and long term?
Well, I mean, if you don't have surface water, you go to groundwater, right? So, I mean, we all need to eat, and people want to eat. And like Nino said, do I need, as a Canadian, do I need to be eating avocados in the wintertime or at all, right? But I mean, consumerism drives demand, and demand drives business. So I think if the water's there, people are going to use it. And if there's not an understanding of how the use could impact the natural resource, then that's why things happen, and that's why issues arise. So
yeah, so our grocery store, the grocery store that I shop at, is about a quarter mile from my office, and here you go in the produce section, and all the berries, they're still berries, and they're all from California. So yeah, it's in the middle of winter. So yeah, it is the back to this social behavioral change that's needed. I think that's something especially Deb and I were involved in writing a proposal. It didn't get funded, but we spent a lot of time thinking about the how to make behavioral changes, the social ecological systems, and so that's I want to. Anyway, I thought I hadn't asked that question of Roberts, but I had. There's a question here. So we have to figure out how to get into people's brains. That's important. That's important for climate change. It's important for water sustainability. But there's a question here from Ibrahim Kake from Sierra Leone. How can you get groundwater from the slums part to be safe for drinking? And so I think that has to do with basically water treatment. Anyone want to take a stab at that? And this may end up being our last question. Except I just saw a question from Chinchi. We'll try to get that one in. Okay, go ahead. Anybody on the Sierra Leone question?
I'll take a crack at it. Having dealt with water treatment as a previous life, it's very dependent. I mean, those are there's very local treatment options if we're talking about biologicals versus metals versus salinity. It really depends on what you're treating. Everything's treatable. It just depends on the cost, and that's sometimes where there's an issue, and that's where that social the trade-offs between water availability and water supply, and it can be a challenge because treatment can be very expensive depending on where your source is and what you're treating it for.
Yeah, and I don't follow the technology side that closely, but I hope that there is an increase in the amount of, even smaller, doesn't have to be, giant water treatment centers, but local options for treating water, maybe on the spot, maybe powered by, solar energy. I know that there are some small scale things that have happened. I don't know that that can be done at scale. So I hope to see that that's on the rise. I have a question from Chinchi Mohan. Most groundwater overexploited regions are low income regions. These regions have a huge gap in data availability and often lack the financial capacity to adhere to a scientific management plan. Neno, what role can international bodies like IGRAC play in improving groundwater management in these regions?
I haven't seen vision. Where is in the chat or in?
This is in Q&A.
In Q&A. Okay. Okay. And that's from all this from Chinchu.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Well, when you have a poverty combination and the lack of groundwater management, then it's this question also from colleague from Sierra Leone about slums. I've seen quite some slums in my life, and it's very difficult to get people clean water there. What we can do, we can raise awareness, and we can try to get some international funds to increase capacity, and that's what we are doing. We can assist people to with groundwater development, but it is that's what we do, and IGRAC is a small groundwater center, but the only global groundwater center affiliated to the United Nations, and that also is saying something about recognition of groundwater internationally as a huge problem. I would just like to stress that there are parts of the world where we are pumping a lot of groundwater which is not replenished. So we are, increasing a problem. And it's very important to have this kind of open discussions and to raise awareness. Next year, it will be Year of Groundwater UN, and it will be World Water Day devoted to groundwater. It will be World Water Assessment Report on groundwater, which can be used as a baseline for capacity building and further awareness raising. So that's, just keep on trying and doing our best.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Neno. I think you speak for all of us. And if you haven't seen the work of IGRAC, I do recommend you go to, Google it, find the website, and look at the work that they're doing. They should be, I've been a huge supporter of Neno's work through the years, and they should have a much bigger staff. Given the scale of the problem, they should have much more funding and a much bigger staff. So that's a good place. Optimistic, or maybe a little bit of inspiration to think about for the future. This is a great place to wrap it up. Thank you so much to our guests and to all of our participants for joining us today. Debra Perrone, Michael Nemeth, Neno Kokourek, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Just a reminder to the audience, if you go to the letstalkaboutwater.ca website to watch the films, find out, and so we've got films, we've got a podcast, but there is a $10,000 US dollars film prize by making a short 2-minute film about water. So please go in and take a look. We also have a youth engagement program, mostly for Canada, where we are encouraging students also in their classes to make 2-minute films, and there are prizes for the schools. So I'm Jay Famiglietti. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you again on World Water Day, March 22nd, where the theme will be valuing water. Stay tuned for that. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks.